Hi there, I'm Evan Troxel. Welcome to my podcast about how technology is changing the architectural profession. Welcome back to the Troxel Podcast. I'm Evan Troxel, and on this episode, I have a conversation with Donna Sink. Donna is an architect in Indianapolis. She's also known for her contributing editor role at Archinect, and she's also a co-host of the Archinect Sessions podcast. And I've been listening to that for years. I've been reading her writing and editorial, both at Archinect and on Twitter. And I've always enjoyed Donna's point of view. And she had a recent tweet that went out talking about payment for architects based on successful outcomes, a la the healthcare industry shift that has been happening as of late, which we get into quite a bit in this episode because that really prompted me to kind of come back at her idea with some additional thoughts that I've been having along with some colleagues in the office that I work in. And so I thought this would be a great conversation to share and have out loud with other individuals who have not been in the room, but to kind of bounce ideas back and forth and see where that goes. So this is a fantastic conversation around a potential different business model for architects, and then how we could start to shift our profession in that direction. Let's jump right into the conversation with Donna Sink. I hope you enjoy it. Where did your idea come from about having a shared outcomes kind of a contract, or I don't know how you want to actually state it, but maybe you could frame the conversation based on that, and then we could just talk about how this happened, how this conversation is coming out of that.
I feel like it's all part of a much larger topic within our discipline, which is, for me, something that I always react very strongly to and against is the idea that architects are, we're driven by our egos, and we only want to design the things that we want to design the way we want them, and not to do things that make our clients happy. And I have always approached architecture as in a way, a service industry. And to me, that goes back to very early. So I went to college in 1985 is when I started architecture school. And in my third year of architecture school, I took a studio where we focused on post-occupancy evaluations. And so there was a tweet about how architects would do better work if we would always do a post-occupancy evaluation. And I kind of responded, well, who's going to pay for that? Because I know from 30 years of practice that post-occupancy evaluations are typically not included in any way in part of our fee. But right. I also know from my third year in architecture school that people love to talk about the buildings that they inhabit and what works for them and what doesn't. So this studio I took was basically the first 6 weeks was just doing POEs, going out to buildings around the city. This was in Tucson, Arizona, and talking to people who had recently begun occupying a recently designed building about their experiences, what worked well and what didn't, and what things were too far apart, and where was noise coming from that wasn't working out because it interrupted their workday. It was mostly offices we were doing. And so that informed my design work from the very beginning of my design career. And I know that there are all kinds of architects, but I think that the vast majority of us are people who want our clients to be happy. We want our owners and people that use our buildings to enjoy them and like them.
Yeah.
And so you and I just got to talking then on Twitter about how could that be folded into a service in some way? Because as I said, post-occupancy evaluations are typically there's no fee for that, not for the architects, certainly. So how can we be, as architects, responsible to our owners and to the buildings and to continuing a relationship that we all can benefit from afterwards? And that's a whole lot of ideas all shoved into a 4-minute discourse. So
yeah, and it takes me back to actually a couple different things. So there's the relationship part that you just talked about, and then there's this whole idea of post-occupancy, right? So I was at a Tech Plus conference here in LA maybe a year ago or so, and Dr. Rupalinanda from HKS, she's the director of research there, gave a presentation, and they're a research group operating within HKS, and they do all kinds of really interesting kind of living laboratory kind of work where they're studying how people use space, they're studying the outcomes of their design, they're trying to link outcomes to design work, right? Where I think that's really where this kind of motivation comes from, right? Which is, why do a POE at all? and it's hopefully to inform the next, right? And that's
Right.
why what we do is called practice. But she really talked about it as, this whole, just even the naming of it is kind of silly, right? Calling it post occupancy. She actually just redefined that as life, right? That
Right.
pre-occupancy is sculpture, right?
Right.
And
That's
so,
actually beautiful.
yeah, I thought so too. And so when she's talking about working in design, we should always be thinking during occupancy, because occupancy is the longest stretch of a project's life, right? And so
Yeah.
you're taking a very kind of empathetic approach and saying, when we're doing this work and we're doing it as service to or in service of a particular set of functions or people and all those things, that we're actually thinking during occupancy and how will it be used. And I think that's one thing that architects do strive to do, and especially with that service kind of approach. And so it's kind of sad when we leave so much on the table and don't do the POE, right? Because then up until that point, all of this stuff is just hypothesis, and the building is just a prototype. And if you don't actually study how the hypothesis and the prototype play out, then what are you doing? Like, you're just reinventing the same potential bad problems every single time.
Absolutely. And then you're also feeding into a culture, in my mind, that says that when something starts to get worn out or worn or used, that it becomes much less valuable.
You
that
throw
we
it out.
focus on this idea of the day that the building is finished, we take the photograph for the magazine and that's it. And then it's perfect and it's in stasis and nothing will ever be as good or perfect again. But, you look at, cultures across the world and all kinds of vernacular building where the maintenance of the building is just part of the life of the building. And I love that you use that phrase that post-occupancy is really just life. Like, yeah, this is the life of your home or your building or your whatever it is going to include wear and patina and all these things that sometimes we really value, but then sometimes we don't. And I think we need to, come to an understanding as a culture that perfect photograph on the day of substantial completion, that's a moment in time.
It's an
event. And it's the ongoing life of the building that is interesting and that we should be striving to make quality,
Yeah, what she stated after that, I thought this was pretty beautiful too. It was just that occupancy is the oxygen of your building.
Exactly.
Yeah, because that first event, that photograph, is that kind of hello world moment. But then after that is when everything actually happens and all of those hypotheses get tested, right? So
Yes. It's a really beautiful notion. And that's the beginning of the building, not the end.
Right.
And, from an architecture practice standpoint, just as a firm, we get most of our work through former clients or recommendations. So you want your owner to be happy, because then you will get more work from them, or you will get recommendations for additional work for other owners or from other clients. But then, the fact is, if you design a building and 5 years later the occupant of it is unhappy, you're not going to get those recommendations. How can we do, as you said earlier, how can we learn from the things we have done? How can we go back and evaluate them in a way that we can then learn from them and move forward with better rules, better ways of going about designing? I've been practicing for a long time, so like I said, I just have a lot of experience I've obviously learned by osmosis, but is there a checklist or is there, where's the checklist that says, number one, what are materials holding up? Number two, are environmental systems doing what they were supposed to do for as long as they're supposed to, warranties, all that stuff. But also, how happy are the people that engage with the building every day? The people that are in there.
Yeah. So let's go back to your tweet where this all started, this whole conversation.
Okay.
So I'm going to quote you here. It says, a comparison. Hospitals now get, I think, some of their payment based on successful outcomes. After the operation, did the patient recover fully or have to continue coming back for complications? What if architecture was post-funded by a shared sustainability fund for outcomes? This is where my gears were. They had been turning for a few years now. Like I mentioned in the beginning, a couple of friends of mine colleagues that I work with, who are some of my favorite people, we brainstormed an idea for a potential business model for architectural practice. And just kind of playing off what you were just talking about, there's mechanics behind like a strategy. How do we actually do what you're talking about? But there's also the shared success It has to be a partnership, and the
Right.
partnership has to be based on relationship. And this is where I kind of go back to my own personal experience of working for Apple. And I think I've shared this on the podcast before, but this idea of how do you build relationship in a transactional kind of a space where when I was training for Apple, they basically, and it was profound to me at the time, and I think it still kind of sounds profound because most of the capitalistic ways in which we operate are not based on relationship, they're based on the transaction. And so they would draw the comparison that if you go into a Best Buy and somebody buys a computer from Best Buy, that's where the relationship ends. In an Apple store, if you purchase a computer, that is where the relationship begins. And they were very kind of staunch in that point of view and saying, first of all, you're going to come into the store 3-5 times before you purchase. And so every time you come in, there's got to be, no pressure. No one's on commission. So we're just here to answer your questions. And you start to build trust. You're not building relationship. You're building trust at that point, hopefully. And then once you purchase, you decide to spend a bunch of money on this thing, whether it's a car, computer, a house, a piece of architecture, like whatever that thing is, how do you then keep the relationship going? And so they would offer classes, they offer support, they'll open the store early for people to come in and learn something. There was all these different kind of tactics that they had in place to make sure that you enjoyed the thing that you purchased from them and would hopefully, like you said, this referral system or this word of mouth, like you're going to come back and you're going to do it again, hopefully. Now, that doesn't happen a lot with architecture, but it does happen with certain client types where they're building on a campus or they're developers or whatever. It's not necessarily going to happen with residential or, maybe sometimes, but very rarely. So how do you build a relationship over time? And so this is where my colleagues and I started thinking like, okay, so what if you actually had your pay or your contract was based on the performance of the building over its lifetime? How do you stretch out a contract to be, instead of 3 or 5 years, just this very initial thing, to having that relationship and making sure that clients are happy over the lifetime of their project? Because when do you even decide to do a POE? Is it 3 months after the building opened, 6 months, 1 year?
Right.
But then what?
Right.
Where did it go from there? I'll stop talking. I want you to jump in.
It's okay. I mean, there's so much to go into here. One of the very first times I heard of this notion or thought about this notion really was specifically in relationship to sustainability. And I think it was the Bullitt Center in Seattle, or maybe that one was the one that started this conversation for me. This idea that if you're selling someone on investing now in a solar energy system or a geothermal heat system or something, and you're selling it to the client on the merits of it paying itself back in 10 years, or they're going to have, you're going to renovate your building and you're going to have 50% lower electrical costs because of this renovation. Well, that's something you can very easily test 5-10 years later, right? You check their electric bills now, and then in a year you check them, and in a year you check them, and either you've achieved it or you haven't. So in that way, it would be very easy to set up a payment system where it would be over time, you get more money, assuming that they have actually, that you've met the goals that you say that the building will. So in terms of, the measurable things, the sustainability, the life of materials, the life of mechanics, that's all very easy to do. It's this personal relationship sense that, as you said, is a much harder thing to quantify, but is really interesting. And I just want to throw out this one idea that I've been thinking about as I've been thinking about this conversation is, I recall years and years ago hearing someone say that I think it's a popular notion that when you're trying to get a new client, you would offer them a reduced rate. Mm-hmm. Like, give me a try, see if you like my work. I'll give you a reduced rate to do this first job. Mm-hmm. And this guy said, no, the thing to do is to say, I'm a professional, and so you should pay me the full rate now. But if you like what I do and you come back to me for a second project, I'll give you a reduced rate then, because then we know that we work well together. Right. We know what our relationship is. We know how well we work together, and we know that what each other needs, and it shortcuts a whole lot of that sort of learning process time. So I always loved that idea that, the first job is full price because it's just a transaction. But as you build the relationship, you can start to then lower your fee, lower your how much time you know it's going to take. It just seems like a smarter way to go about it.
Yeah, it seems natural because you are going to understand preferences that you're just going to be able to design right into that other project rather than have to figure all that out through the discovery process of the first one over and over again.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. But yeah, going back to my initial tweet about hospitals, and that comes from a little bit of actually doing post-occupancy evaluation, but I was working on a master plan for a local hospital where we interviewed a lot of their workers to see what kind of staff space they needed. Now, this was all pre-pandemic. So, of course, with the pandemic, everything has changed. But this was several years ago. But the notion was that the way that hospitals were billing at this point was not just billing for procedures, but billing for outcomes. That you don't just bill for the surgery and then that's the end. You have a price for the surgery, but then if the patient has to come back again because they have an infection, if they have to come back because something's not healed properly, that all adds up the cost. And so the insurer doesn't want to have to keep paying for that. So the hospital will get paid more if their outcome is better. If the patient doesn't have to keep coming back, the hospital will then actually get paid more by the insurance company. And so thinking about that in terms of architecture, like you said, I'm going to do this building and it's going to make your worker productivity is going to go up and you're going to have fewer sick days because people are going to have more windows. You know, there's all these things that we can, I think, try to guarantee or say we can provide with our design. And then actually measuring those becomes much more challenging in terms of spiritual, mental health outcomes. It's much more challenging.
True. But you actually have to do that work and you have to aggregate that data over time and you have to have it inform what you continue to do. And so this is probably easier for firms that do a lot more projects. But I will just throw it out there, like how many firms are actually doing this at all? Because I think it just gets to that hypothesis stage and then we start again. And we get to that hypothesis stage and then we start again. And there's so much of architecture is starting from the blank sheet of paper because obviously there's differences in projects. I'm not trying to say everything we do is the same, especially where I work and what we practice in. Every client is different to some extent, but there's also lots of stuff that is the same every single time. And there are standards that have been created. And there's, if you're working in a school, there's district standards and there's a lot of stuff that doesn't have to be recreated every single project that comes along. But I think overall, as architects, we're really bad at collecting and then aggregating lots of different data types and finding doing kind of that research-based work to figure out where we're going next.
Yeah. I think that office furniture companies, Knoll and Steelcase, and these guys seem like they do a lot more of that, don't they?
Yes.
Like they look at how people use their furniture and then come back 10 years later to see what needs to be replaced and what.
Yeah. So I've talked to Steelcase recently, and they're building these sensors into their furniture, but they're also using their own showrooms and their own workspaces as a laboratory, which I think is part of the thing that makes a difference. Like Kieran Timberlake is really good at this. Their office is a lab with all of the sensors outfitted, and they learn from themselves, and that informs the design work that they do. And that's what Steelcase does as well.
That's interesting. So Kieran Timberlake, I used to live in Philly, and I remember when they moved into what was then their new office. But since then, they have moved to another new office. So I didn't know that about them, but I know that they are one of the few architects that have really committed to a research arm, right? Like they have I don't remember what it's called. You probably do.
I don't know what it's called either. I haven't looked recently, but I do know that they have started making like their own devices, and they put those out on the IoT market, the Internet of Things, so that they basically, building operators can implement these systems into their own facilities so that they can also learn, it plugs into the building management system and they can learn from their occupants and their specific site and context. So yeah, you're right. They have invested heavily into that, and it has really informed, especially on the sustainability side, the energy management, all those kinds of things, what they do and why they do it.
Thinking about the idea of using your office as a lab or using your showroom as a lab for trying stuff out. I do have a friend who's a very small practitioner in Kentucky. He does amazing work. And I think that he did his own office in a way that he could show people, here's an idea I wanted to try out. But I think that he has also built a relationship and a reputation with clients that they will allow him to test some things on their projects, knowing that it's a test, right? Knowing that, okay, we're going to try an experiment here and see how it works out. And I think that someone like Kieran Timberlake or other firms that sort of invest in this kind of research can probably, again, offer that to their clients and say, we want to try this thing. We think it'll be a great success, but it might not be. But if you trust us to try it with you, you can make it a happy outcome for everyone. It doesn't have to be a zero-sum game to design it, right? It can be something where you test a notion and they like it, or you test it and they don't like it. So you have some kind of feedback where you're able to come back and change it or fix it. Or, I'm thinking about this is, again, more on notions of using different materials or using aesthetic material ideas that maybe will or won't work out, like a living green wall. I mean, that's kind of an obvious one. Like a green wall is something that it's always a test. It's always an experiment to see if it's going to work out or not. And for the owner, is it something that will be more of a pain in the butt to keep up and keep watered or not? Right.
Totally. I mean, that's a driver for so many decisions in the design process, especially on public work where, go to Scandinavia, every roof's a green roof. Go to Singapore and they're putting green roofs on buses now because they don't have any buildings left, right? So it's amazing. And over here, it's like a green roof. What are you talking about? No effing way that we're putting a green roof on this building. Why? Because we've never done that before, and somebody doesn't know how to take care of it. And what are they going to have to get a lawnmower up there, and they're going to weed whacker? And it's like, it's an incredibly difficult conversation to have because typically the immediate answer is no way. There's no way we're putting this living. No matter what the checklist of benefits are, it usually comes down to we haven't done this before. So if you can find a client who is willing to, I think there's a couple different categories here. Like what you're talking about where you're actually trying out materials and you're trying to see how they respond to, because getting people to maintain a building is hard enough, right? And then adding something else on top of that they actually have to go out and take care of on a regular basis is a whole other level. But there's also just kind of the data collection side of things, right? Where it's like, you don't have to do anything. And there's not even a like or dislike. It's just, let's collect data so that we understand ourselves better kind of a thing. And to me, when you're talking about that side of the conversation, you've got to figure out a way to provide value for the client as well as yourself, right? So that data could be really useful for you as an architect, especially on the next project, and especially if you have 10 projects that you're doing this on. Right. But what's the client get out of it? Why should they go through the extra rigmarole or the extra expense to put the sensors in if that data isn't going to benefit them somehow, right? So how can that I think it's easier with certain client types like healthcare, right? Where they want to know how they can optimize nursing steps every day, right? Versus a school where it's like, how are we going to maintain that? Because I've got one guy in 10 schools, right, to go around and do this.
It's almost like it's something that operates on either a very small or a very large scale, right? It's either a client you have a personal relationship and you're working on their house and it's something that you'll go back and see them every few months anyway because you're friendly with them, and then it's on the level of a hospital, That's why someone like Steelcase can do it. They're a big company, they can work it into their how their company works, their business procedures, or very, very small scale, sole practitioner or small. It reminds me of a roofer I heard of once, a roofer who would do a residential roof and then would call the owner, the month before their 1-year warranty was up, call them back and say, hey, I'm just checking in to see if you have anything that needs to be done while you're still under warranty, let me know.
So smart.
And so that gives the owner more comfort and optimism and trust about the project. And then it lets the roofer learn where are the where are the things that his crew has tended to not do as well as they should have.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a huge deal, right? That's super smart to think of it that way.
Yeah. Super smart.
Yeah. And I agree. I think one of the advantages a company like Steelcase has is by deciding to do the data collection, and because they're not just working with a small or a big client, they're working with lots and lots of clients, which include architects and actual facilities, right? They could go to a campus
Yes.
or they could go to an architect and partner with them. They're then collecting so much data that they can use that to inform everybody's decisions that they work with. And so then it adds value to their offering because they're giving you informed data based on actual use. So they're saying these kinds of conference rooms work in these kinds of environments. This kind of furniture works in these kinds of environments. And that adds value because it gives me peace of mind deciding to recommend their system to a client. But it's also real data that it's not just somebody's hypothesis. They're saying, no, based on the last 12 months of activity in this range of client type, in these types of urban areas or whatever you're looking for, they can say, here's how it works. And you really can't argue with data, right? That's the beauty of it.
Yeah, it's funny. You saying that just makes me realize that, I spent 5 years working not as an architect, but working in the facilities department of an art museum.
Yeah.
So I was on the facilities side of things, and in that role could see how important these long relationships with suppliers were. I mean, having Herman Miller come in there and deal with our office furniture, it was an enormous amount of knowledge and experience and ability that our in-house staff didn't have to have because we could bring them in.
Yeah, that's huge. That's a big deal. So now have you thought about any kind of practical ways that this kind of idea that was in your original tweet, like how could that actually happen for architects? Like how would you put that kind of a system in place if you could to get paid based on these outcomes?
I'm going to fall back on what I just said about it either being very large or very small and say that from a larger standpoint, it seems to me it's more driven by things like the mechanical systems and the energy expenditures of the building. Mm-hmm. But from a very small standpoint, it's going to be, having a personal relationship with someone and saying, I'll work on your kitchen remodel. And if a year from now you find that there's nowhere to plug in a toaster or whatever, you don't have to pay me the additional fee, but I'll hold back some of that fee for a year. It's a really challenging thing to think about contractualizing.
Yeah.
Because I do it already with my small scale residential clients. I keep in touch with them and I know what's going on, but it's not about my fee being withheld though, or about me getting a better fee later. The payback is in recommendations that they make.
Sure.
So contractualizing it within a larger context, I think would have to be around things like energy efficiency. How often do you have to turn on the lights in a space that I've designed for you, saying you can just light it with natural daylight, but then if it turns out they have to actually keep the lights on all the time, how do I not get paid as much a year, 2 years, 5 years later?
Yeah.
I have not really thought about how to do it contractually.
See, I think this is where like the technology side of this podcast comes in. So this is where our mind started to go when we were thinking about this, because there's two sides to everything. There's the one side, which is like, how do you fundamentally change the way that a project is contracted? And how do you even decide that it's safe and not risky to do that in a company that's been operating for 80 plus years, that's always done it this one way? And that goes for like every architecture firm out there for the most part, right? It's like we have this fee-based structure based on these milestones and that's it, right? Now there's what I've seen with technology is there's an ability now to think about or divide payments into much smaller amounts. And this goes along with this kind of analogy that I have of streaming music or streaming video like Netflix, right?
Yes,
so the idea is now bandwidth was always a huge issue as we were growing up with the internet because you downloaded files and the file was this huge, if it's video, it was this big thing. And to combat that, we just made the videos smaller and smaller as far as like pixel real estate on the screen. Mm-hmm. And so now that's not an issue. And why is that? It's because the files can be broken up into these seemingly infinite amounts and they could just get doled out as necessary, right? To create enough buffer so that you can watch or listen to the thing. And so when you think about like the way that files are now delivered and the way that they're streamed, I think we can also draw the analogy to currency because of things like cryptocurrency. So I was looking into like Bitcoin and cryptocurrency, and Bitcoin by definition, like, or, when it was being designed, can be divided, like the smallest amount is called a millibitcoin, and it's 100 millionth of a Bitcoin. Versus a dollar, right? You can divide it down into 1/100ths, right? 1 cent is the lowest you can go. So if you can now divide some currency into 100 millionth of a unit, now like that currency is streamable, and you're not reliant upon, I guess even at 1/100th, it would probably still be fine. But the idea now is that I think money has the ability to be streamed because of Bitcoin, because it is just like a digital version, and using blockchain, which is the ledger system, it doesn't get corrupted. There's no like question about where that money's coming from or going to. And I think one of the beauties of a system like this is once you've kind of hooked it up, it can be bidirectional. And so going back to the idea of building performance, if the building is performing well, if it's performing as advertised,
right,
money can be flowing to you. And if it's not, the consequences could be that it's flowing to them, right? And so now I think if currency is streaming, now there is an incentive to not lose the money, right, on the architect's side during the course of this relationship. And think about Tesla owners, right? What happens when I've seen it on Twitter all the time. I don't own a Tesla, so I don't know for sure, but I've seen this over and over again. My car got new features today. Have you seen this?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Operating system upgrades over the air. Yeah. I mean, the car is hooked up to your house Wi-Fi. It gets an update or it's on cellular. Boom. It's like you've got ludicrous mode all of a sudden, right? And you didn't have that yesterday. What if your building was the same? Why can't it be? We're talking about computer-controlled hardware in a building. The building management system is all on the network. And so why can't an architect be incentivized to continually make that better and deliver upgrades overnight, over time? And the better that building performs, base the contract on that and just get paid as it happens rather than some lump sum for a hypothesis up front or some averaged out graph over in the future.
So I get this idea, but I mean I think it's amazing, and I love the idea that there's like a pool of value that is your Bitcoin or whatever, that if the building's performing, it's flowing to me, the architect, and if it's not performing well, it's flowing back to the owner, and you have a shared interest in that. But I'm still getting hung up on the idea of how do you measure that other part of what we do as architects, which is bring joy to people's lives through the built environment, right? Like how do you upgrade the carpeting overnight?
No, absolutely. I think there's like an actual data performance side of things, but there's multiple other arms to this as well that are not considered in this.
But it also then comes to a place where the marketplace has to understand that yes, good energy performance has value, and ease of access for your workers so they don't have to commute long dates or whatever, that has value. And then just that your employees feel happy, that has value. That mental those fuzzy logic things that are hard to quantify, that does have value, and that design does have a part in imparting that value, in making that value exist.
Yeah, I mean, and that's where architects can make a big difference.
Sure. It's acknowledging that all of those different realms have value, and we have to work in all of them. We have to be successful on all of them to really make a great piece of architecture.
That's true, and I think one of the things that I don't want to say push back on, but I think that the data side of it is where architects have probably not done the most, or what they should be doing as far as the environment goes. It's much easier to point at something and say like, well, that's an amazing museum because of the way it makes people feel. And like, I think there's obvious examples of where good architecture really shines from the aspects that you're talking about that are a lot more touchy-feely, right? Which is absolutely important. And then at the same time, we just reject the data side of things. or we have historically.
I think we do, yes, because we do very much want to make people feel happy and feel joy through our buildings. So we reject that data really has any part to do with that, but it obviously does. I always think about the warmth on a stone wall, that it feels wonderful and warm in the winter when you're chilly, but then in the summer it's just hot and reflective, and you just wish, why isn't there a tree here? That can be made into data related to what's the ambient temperature of that day, how many cold, cloudy days have there been in the days before. Like it is all related to some kind of data that we can quantify. And this may be a bit of a leap, but my sister is a doctor, and she said that she participated in a study where they were trying to get people to eat more vegetables. Like, you can say eat more vegetables, it's better for you. There's more fiber. There's all these reasons why it's better for your heart, better for it. But ultimately, the way that they found they could get the most people to eat more vegetables was to ask them, okay, did you eat vegetables yesterday? Yes. And how did you feel today? You feel pretty good? And they would say, yeah, I feel pretty happy today.
Yeah, tie those things together.
You have to tie those things together. Exactly. Right. That if you don't say, oh, it's about fiber, but say, oh, do you feel good? And if you feel happy when you eat vegetables, maybe that's a good reason to keep eating them, without saying your heart rate has to go down, and so you have to eat your vegetables because it's good for you.
Yeah.
It's really about that. Yeah. Getting the data from where they are willing to give it or to engage with it, I guess, is the question.
It makes me think of, I'm sorry to do this. I bring it back to Apple again. One of the things that I've noticed over time that they do, like with their phones, is they never tell you what's in the guts of the phone. Mm-hmm. They never tell you how much RAM it has or how fast the processor is. Lots of other manufacturers do that, but it's because they don't want to hang you up with that kind of data. They want you to feel like it's the best phone you've ever used. And they're going to do that by making all the things on the inside work how they need to, rather than tell you about it. It's just going to work. And so I think that's kind of what you're getting at here, which is you're tying an emotion, your a state of being back to a behavior, right? And you're reinforcing the behavior with those outcomes. And so I wonder, like, how do you start to quantify those things architecturally? So if you're a doctor, when the patient comes in, or maybe there's a survey, there's an app, I mean, maybe it could work similarly for architects, but it reminds me of like going into the airport when we used to be able to do that. And you go into the bathroom and there's just like a 3-button thing next to the hand towels that says, like, is the bathroom clean, dirty? There's like 2 or 3 options. I wonder if there's things like that in our lives that you can push based on how you feel in certain locations. I don't know. I'm just trying to think out loud, like, how do you actually start to do that for architects and for inhabitants of our spaces? They're not our spaces, they're their spaces.
Exactly. Inhabitants of the spaces that we hopefully provide for them well. Yeah. I just this morning, and I live in Indianapolis, they put out a call on Twitter for we have a bus rapid transit line coming into play. Uh-huh. And we have one leg of it completed, the red line, and the next line is the purple line. And so they just this morning on Twitter put out a call for people, this is how I understand it at least, to go out and walk along the purple line and find places where the mobility for pedestrians and people with accessibility issues is impaired or difficult, and report it back to the city so that they can make sure to really, address those things.
Crowdsourcing that data.
It's crowdsourcing. Exactly. That's exactly right. It's crowdsourcing that information or that experience. And there's got to be a way to do that, within buildings. And I mean, I'll go back to what I said at the very beginning of this conversation. When I was, 20 years old and doing a post-occupancy evaluation as an architecture student, the people in the building were told that we were coming, and they were sort of told, spend the next week thinking really about what you might tell these people. And back then, of course, we didn't have apps, but, I can imagine the people in that building at that time sitting there, like having their lunch at the break room and saying, oh, this room's really dark. I should tell the architect that. Like, if there was an app where you could put that in at that moment and say, this room is not comfortable for me right now, and this is why. You could crowdsource so much data that way.
Well, WeWork did that, right? They do that with their work environments because it's all, you just go in and you use whatever you need to use when you need to use it, and they have a system set up for you to reserve spaces depending on your needs.
Right.
But then after you use the space, they do have an app that was like, okay, so did you use the technology? Was it comfortable temperature-wise? Was the lighting okay? There's several questions that they ask you, and you can't ask too many questions, right? Because it's too much. But you can ask the right questions, and this starts to get me to think about when you are aggregating or collecting this data. I would imagine that the quality of the question really matters. So
Absolutely.
it can't, and it'll really change the way what data gets presented to you, I would imagine. So when you're telling somebody that you're coming and to think about the way they use their space, and I wonder how that changes things. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's just not in the moment, so it's different.
Yeah.
It's complicated. I mean, and people are complicated, and there's so many variables that we're taking, because there's temperature, there's a thermostat. When there's 50 people in the room, everybody's running at their own temperature. Everybody's got a different metabolism. Everybody's got a different amount of clothing on. Like so, and there's so many different variables here. And when you start to personalize it to that granularity, I could imagine that it's all over the map as far as the kind of feedback that you're going to get.
Absolutely. I mean, this hospital project I worked on where we were interviewing the staff to find out how their workspaces worked for them. A lot of the survey responses would be, I hate my workspace, and you would dig into it a little and find out it's just because they sit right under an air conditioning vent and they're cold all the time.
Right.
Like that's the only problem.
Yeah.
But the way it manifests in their mind is everything about this place is just uncomfortable, and I hate working here. Even though it's a very simple fix, right? Yeah. Just shift the air conditioning blades so that poor lady is not freezing at her work every day.
Right. Right.
There's got to be an algorithm that could work this out.
Well, and then there's hormones, right? And then there's body weight. There's so many things that play into this. Oh my gosh, yeah. So it has to be kind of personalized, and then you get into the data privacy kind of stuff, which is like, what do I share? Exactly right. What can I share? Exactly what should? Yeah, wow. It's so complicated. That's and as if architecture wasn't complicated enough or complex enough already. So I guess when I now that I start to think about this, I start to think, well, how does this change the makeup of a firm as far as like the staff? If we were talking about making changes to buildings over time at a more fine-grained level, who's on your staff now? Yeah,
you need it. Well, so there was when healthcare designs first sort of really started amping up, was it like 10 years ago, 15 years ago? There was I remember an article and a lot of talk in the business about nurses coming on to architecture staff, like people that, and I say women because nurses are generally mostly female, but a woman who has been a nurse and worked her way up to the floor charge nurse, whatever, would come on to an architecture firm like an HOK or whoever, and be part of the staff designing the hospital because it's someone who knows how the workers there use the space, right?
Right.
You need people that have experience in whatever kind of facility it is that you're housing in your design. Yeah. I think you need social workers. I mean, sorry, but I'm going to go back to public school teachers, how they need to understand how a child learns to read, but they also can infer from knowing how the child dresses and if they come to school hungry and if they've had a good night's sleep. They have to be able to be social workers that sort of analyze all this stuff and say, these are the reasons why this is not working so well for this person. So I think you need someone who's like a social scientist, right?
Yep. I mean,
they say we're marriage counselors already, right? When we do houses for people. So
psychologists, marriage counselors. Yeah, absolutely.
Yes, psychologists.
Yeah. And I also think that there's like the data side of things, data analysts. There's got to be programmers who can tweak code and like,
absolutely.
Wow.
Absolutely. And every project you alluded to this at the beginning of our conversation, that you're sort of starting with a huge learning curve at the beginning of every project. Mm-hmm. It seems like there should be a way to not have to do that so drastically.
Yeah.
So the people that are knowledgeable within that realm and maybe not as knowledgeable of design, but are knowledgeable of things like function and data and how to collect it. And that's the people that you need on your team.
And it seems to me like firms in general are pretty, I don't want to say against that, but they're really reluctant to push in those directions. Then I start to think of like what for example, I've read a book previously called Drive by Dan Pink, and it's all about intrinsic motivation.
Yep.
And it's like the science says this, that carrots and sticks don't work. The science says this, yet corporate America insists that carrots and sticks work, right? Every incentive program is based on carrots and sticks. And so the architect's reluctance to hire or to put on staff those positions to do that kind of data analysis or that coding or whatever it requires to be able to learn to get the insight from the whatever does get collected is just kind of mind-boggling to me, because it's just like, well, let's turn the blind eye to that. Like, we really don't want to go in that direction because we're so comfortable doing what we do. And I guess that's what this whole idea is. Like, we could talk about this idea all the time. We could talk about the idea of developing a relationship and collecting data and making it mutually beneficial over the life of a project and making it perform better and seeing how that's going to influence the next project. But how do we actually do that in our profession? How does somebody shift to a new way of doing this kind of work when it's like we're so busy doing the work that we're doing? That to me is where things totally break and the wheels fall off the cart.
So can I go to one of my favorite comparisons and talk about NASA and putting a man on the moon and the space agency? And when Kennedy said we're going to get a man on the moon within this decade, a huge amount of forces and capital came to bear on making that happen. Mm-hmm. And I think that if we want to push for a new way of practice, there has to be a way for it to be paid for. And it may be that it's the general public good, in meaning that the government is paying for it, right? That there's a research grant to firms to do this kind of work, to figure out the housing solutions. And with COVID now, we've got a whole new way we're going to have to think about how offices work, if they're going to work at all.
Right.
And I think the way to make that work in the market is to have someone be funding it. And that probably means a huge entity like the government.
That's an
I don't know
idea.
who else is going to grant it, right?
It also seems though like that speech that Kennedy gave was very much a catalyst of inspiration.
Absolutely.
Who's that for architecture or the environment or?
I mean, Elon Musk has been, and I don't especially I'm not a fan of Elon Musk, but he has certainly sparked the imagination of a whole lot of people talking about stuff like Hyperloop or, they may be ridiculous, but he knows how to spark an excitement.
Yeah. Or going to Mars. Yeah. Yeah.
Going to Mars. Exactly.
That's I think that's exactly what's needed for the built environment, is somebody who's, and it doesn't have to be a singularity. It has to be
right.
It could be any number of things, but it doesn't seem like that I can think of somebody who's not there. There's definitely instances of that at architecture firms, but not for the profession or not for the built environment at large, that has that kind of a platform or a stage that they stand upon. Right. Well, maybe a listener of this podcast will be that.
Yeah. Yeah. Or suggest someone. I mean, I think that I definitely use Twitter, and it's interesting that, this whole conversation came about because of Twitter. Mm-hmm. I definitely use Twitter to sort of keep up on what kinds of conversations are happening. And I know that, the chatter about things like accessible cities and bike and pedestrian friendly and able and other able-bodied accessibility, this is all stuff people feel enormously passionate about.
True.
And building some of that energy into, pushing for funding or granting or the public good to take notice. I think that energy exists. It's just, finding a way to tap into it and to get it organized.
Yeah.
So, yeah. More
questions than... I mean, this is obviously just the beginning of a conversation like this, but I would love to hear what other people think about, or what other directions this could go, because it does seem like there's a fundamental shift necessary to address the biggest problems of our time. And architects should have a seat at that table, but we have to want to sit at that table, and we have to want to address those problems, or at least try to figure out how to. It seems to me like these are probably a lot more important than anything else going on that we could, if you start to think about these problems as being multi-generational, right? Or multi-lifetime problems to solve. That is really kind of the framing that needs to happen.
and interconnected problems, because we have resource issues, we have labor issues, there's so many societal contextual relationships that come into play when you start to talk about any of these. So if you're thinking, in a very small scale of just how do I keep my electric bill down, well, you have to ultimately get out to a much bigger scale of how do we extract resources from the earth to do so, and who does it for us. So these things are incredibly intertwined. And architects are good at doing that. That's the way we've been taught to think, is to think very holistically about a lot of things. And so I think we should be at that table.
Yeah.
But yeah, we're going to have to sort of push in and demand it.
Yeah.
So yeah, any ideas, listeners?
Let's throw it out there. Well, maybe we can start to wrap up. Can I ask you? I didn't ask you about this ahead of time, so I'm going to throw it at you now, and you can, of course, decline. I have 2 questions and then an ask of you at the end. So the first one I'm using to kind of tie all these different episodes together and have my guest answer is: share something that you do to help yourself perform better. It doesn't have to be tech. It doesn't have to be digital. It could be analog. It could be physical. Just anything that you do to help yourself get better, do better at what you do.
I ask a lot of questions, and as I've gotten older, I've been less embarrassed about asking things that might seem like an obvious or a dumb question, because most of the time I realize that other people in the room also have the same question that I have. So basically, I'm not afraid to ask the question that might make me look dumb, because it usually doesn't.
Yeah. Usually there's other people in the room who had the same question and are so glad that you asked that dumb question.
Yep. And so I'm happy to set myself up as the fool who asks that, because then it helps everyone else in the room. Yeah.
No, it's absolutely great, because if you don't have information that's necessary, then how can you address what needs to be addressed? I think that's
exactly.
And it takes experience to get to the point where I think you just don't care about how you're going to look. Yeah.
That's where I am now in my life. I'm 53 years old. I don't care. I just want to know.
Learn that early in your life and you'll get even farther. Yeah. Exactly. All right. So next question, who are you listening to or reading right now? Who's influencing Donna?
I am listening to 2 bands that I've been loving. One of them is called Khruangbin. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, because the spelling is really weird. They're a mostly instrumental group.
Can you spell it?
I think it's K. I'll email it to you when I find it. I think it's Khruangbin, something like that. Okay. Khruangbin. I'll email it to you or text it. And they're just mind-blowing and cool. And awesome. Then I've been listening to a band, and I say this with some trepidation, even though I just said to you I'm not embarrassed to look like the fool. There's this band called Lake Street Dive from Boston, and apparently they've been around for a long time, and I just heard one of their songs and completely fell in love, and now I can't stop listening to them. So they might be like they're kind of white person soul, which is again a little embarrassing, but it's pretty soulful and it's really good. So those are my 2 newest bands I'm listening to.
Good recommendations.
In terms of music.
Okay. And are you reading anything interesting that's kind of influencing your thinking or just inspiring you?
Sadly, this is not super helpful, but I'm reading, and I can't remember the name of the book. I mostly read fiction. Mm-hmm. And again, I'll have to just send you the name of the book because I can't. Oh, Zookeeper, something about a zookeeper. It's a story about a Polish zoo in World War II and how the Germans come in and invade and they take all the animals for their own zoos. And it's giving me a real historical sense. It's historical fiction, historical sense of what it's like living in an occupied city. And with all that's going on in the country and the world right now with our leadership and politics, it's just, I kind of feel like it's almost a guide to something that may be coming. So it's actually kind of sad, but it's fiction.
Prescient.
The Zookeeper's Wife, I think, is what it's called.
Okay.
And yeah, I tend to read fiction. The Zookeeper's Wife, that's what it's called. I read fiction because frequently when I read fiction, it helps me think about the things I'm actually working on at work or that I'm, working on in my life. I use fiction as a way to sort of, some people believe in astrology. Mm-hmm. I don't, but I will read a story and I'll let the story sort of guide how I'm thinking about things. So, yeah.
It's interesting how those outside things can unlock something that you've been working on for who knows how long, right? It's so
That's
interesting.
exactly right.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. It's about unlocking a different way of looking at a problem.
Yeah. Interesting.
So I go to fiction for that all the time.
Very cool. All right. So last question, not really a question. Where can people find out more about you or follow along what you're doing online, anywhere?
Well, Archinect is my number one. Like, I've been an editor at Archinect for 20 years, almost 20 years. I think the site's been around for 20 years. And awesome. I have been a contributing editor at Archinect, which means I just comment there a lot. That's what being a contributing editor means, is I do a lot of commentary in the forums and I submit articles every now and then, but it's not like I'm a writer. I'm just an active person on Archinect. And I post there under my real name, Donna Sink, although I started 20 years ago there. I was called Liberty Bell was my screen name, and sometimes I still post under that name as well. But it's pretty commonly known that Liberty Bell and Donna Sink are the same person. And then my Twitter is, I really try to keep my Twitter all about architecture, and I have an amazing group of architweeps, as we refer, including you, Evan, and all of the people that we both know together in common. And I love the Twitter interaction. I just feel like there's a whole lot of fun, and it leads to good, serious conversations like this one that happens on Twitter. So Donna Sink Arc is my handle on Twitter. And you have a podcast. And I do a podcast on Archinect Sessions. We have not been keeping up with it as well as you guys have been over at Archispeak. We have not done as many interview sessions lately, although we may be doing some more coming up here. The Archinect Sessions podcast, when the pandemic started and everyone hit lockdown, we did a series where we interviewed people just on what they were doing. And almost all of them have been, sent home to work remotely. We're trying to figure out, some people have been laid off. It's just that was a nice chance for people to sort of just get a sense of what else is going on in the architecture world. I'm such a booster of architects and our culture. I love what we all do and how we all think about the world in these much more complex ways than I think a lot of other disciplines do, because we have to bring so much to bear on what we design. So I'm just a huge booster of architects and a big fan of us. So I like connecting with people in that way. Thank you for doing that. I really feel like, nobody asked you to do that. You don't have to do it. It's all because you obviously get something out of it, but you provide so much to so many other people. And so thank you. As do you. I mean, thank you for this podcast and the other one. And I think, whenever I comment on things, or I am always thinking about not the other people commenting, but the people who are just reading and hopefully learning something about it. Absolutely. Yeah. I think, and I think we do that in our field. We're a field that has been built on internships and mentorship. And I just think we need to keep doing that for each other. Absolutely. So, yeah. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to have this conversation today. I appreciate it so much. I'll talk to you soon. Great talking with you. Stay safe out there. Stay healthy. Bye-bye. Thanks for hanging out with us today. This show is part of the Gable Media Podcast Network. You can see all the shows at gablemedia.com. That's GABLMEDIA.com. You can help support what I'm doing here by leaving a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts to help get the word out, and of course, share it with your friends. I'd love to hear from you, so leave a comment on the website at trxl.co/podcast, where you can find every episode. You can also follow me on Twitter and Instagram and YouTube. Just search for E. Troxel. Talk to you soon.